The high sky over evening love. At the crossroads of life, when John's wife Mary went beyond the horizon, he was left alone in the quiet sadness of his home. It seemed the house suddenly became larger, and the corners darker and colder. He sat on the old worn-out sofa, where not long ago they had shared memories and worries, talking about a life that had worn them down considerably. For she had left him alone in this world, and the children and grandchildren had scattered, some to California, some to Chicago, some across the ocean. It remained for him and Mary to live out their days together here, in the old house on the outskirts of town, where all their acquaintances had long departed from life or moved to retirement homes. Mary often leaned her silvery head onto his shoulder like a tired dove and whispered with a trembling voice, whether to God or to him, "When will you let me go? My strength is fading, John, like snow in the sun, and my sun is already setting. How much longer will I hold on?" And John stroked her thin, soft hair and gently replied, "We'll live a little longer, Mary. We'll still see the grandchildren come to us. Do you remember how Benjamin loves your blueberry pies? As soon as he arrives, he eats a whole plate. So hang in there, my dear." And Mary hung on, as she could. But one evening, misfortune quietly entered their home and took her away. There were both a doctor and an ambulance, but no one could block the path of the old predatory guest. And so Mary left, leaving John alone, with his sad solitude, with his silence that nothing could dispel. Yet sometimes John felt that she was still nearby. He lay in their bed, the very one where Mary once prayed before sleep, hoping they would both wake up together in the morning. And then suddenly from the kitchen or from the empty living room, her voice drifted in, so familiar, so dear, a bit exhausted as always. "John, where are you?" He sprang up, went to the kitchen, peeked into the hallway, looked out the window. Silence. Empty. Only darkness outside the windows and the shadow of the empty house. And although it seemed that something was rustling somewhere, it was probably just the wind. Because Mary was no more, and she wouldn't be anymore. She looked at him from an old photograph, sadly, as if with a slight reproach, as if asking, "Well, John, are you bustling around again? I'm so far away now that not even a bus comes here. I will wait for you here. Maybe we will meet again if God allows that meeting." John lay on his old creaky bed, pulling the cool blanket over himself. If only he could fall asleep. If only he could disappear from that lonely house into some dream, into some oblivion. But sleep did not come, like a weary morning reluctant to brighten and lingering in a gray, sticky twilight. He clicked the switch. The dim light flickered on, only emphasizing the emptiness of the room. He pressed the button of the old radio, only silence in response. Another day slowly wandered somewhere outside the window, hiding behind the hills, behind the wind, as if afraid to show itself to people. "Rest," it seemed to whisper. "Dream your dreams. I am not ready to show you the sun yet." John felt sad. He stepped into the kitchen, and there, as if alive, the burnt pots looked at him, still left on the stove from the previous evening. On the table stood an unfinished glass of whiskey. Yesterday, his friend, an old mate from the neighboring street, Thomas, had come by. They shared a similar fate. Both had ended up alone. They sat for a while, drank, talked about who was still alive, who had already gone. John looked at that glass and wondered whether to pour a little more. But then he just sighed heavily, because he knew he couldn't help himself. They had mourned together then, Thomas and he. John saw his friend to the door, waved goodbye, and returned to his empty house, to his silent sorrow. The dishes remained on the table, uncleaned, untouched. In the end, he found an old knife with a curved blade in a drawer, tossed it into the sink with some forks, rinsed everything off under the tap. For dessert, he peeled a few potatoes. Maybe he'd fry them for breakfast. "Well, whatever," he thought. "I'll get through until morning." Outside the windows, it began to gray, as if the sun didn't really want to rise that day. That morning, John decided to finally step outside his home, to go to the neighboring town. He sat on a bench by the bus stop. Time stretched slowly, like rubber. But why hurry when no one was waiting for him anywhere? A middle-aged woman approached the stop. She nodded briefly to him in greeting. A gray sweater softly accentuated her figure, high breasts, and around her face was a cascade of wavy light hair. John involuntarily noted to himself, "Well, look at that. Not bad at all." "Where are you headed?" he asked, pretending it was just a casual conversation. "Oh, just to not sit at home," replied the woman with a somewhat weary lightness. "I'm going to the hospital." "Something hurts?" John asked with a hint of sympathy. "My heart hurts," she replied and looked at him directly. "You know, I've been living alone for years, lonely, and no one ever asks, 'How are you, Megan?' If only to argue with someone, it would be easier." "So your name is Megan?" John smiled a bit warmer. "I gathered that from how you complain about your fate." "That's how fate is," sighed Megan. "It's been 2 years since everything went downhill, and I sit at home, like some mushroom in a dark corner. No one. And to be honest, I have forgotten how to talk. There's no one to talk to." She tried to smile, but it came off more sadly than cheerfully. "I understand you," John said softly. "It seems our fates have something in common." He felt a little uplifted by this conversation and dared, "Maybe. Do you have a phone number?" "Yes." Megan nodded, a little surprised but without refusal. John quickly pulled out an old notebook and a pen from his pocket, neatly wrote down the numbers she dictated. When her bus arrived, John felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't want her to go. It seemed like something important was about to begin, and here came the separation. Megan smiled in goodbye, showing her beautiful white teeth, and cheerfully said, "Well, don't forget to call." And with a slight wave of her hand, she disappeared into the dark interior of the bus. That evening, John stared at the number he had written down for a long time, and then he dialed anyway. And when he heard her warm, slightly hoarse voice on the receiver, he felt for the first time in a long time that he was no longer entirely alone. And thus everything began. They called each other almost every evening, as if confessing. They talked about everything, about loneliness, about their children, about grandchildren, about the small and big worries that surrounded them from all sides. Sometimes they would smile together, sometimes they would sigh, for who else could you tell how you feel, if not to that person who understands? And one day John gathered his courage and said, "You know, Megan, tomorrow is a holiday, Independence Day. Maybe we can go together to a restaurant, celebrate properly." Megan was a bit surprised but smiled warmly. Why not? Sounds like a good idea. She really knew how to dress well. And when the next day they met by the big old maple at the corner of the main street, the tree with broad leaves rustling overhead as if whispering something sacred, John froze. She looked so stunning that his heart tightened in his chest. Slender in a light summer dress, with slightly tousled but beautifully arranged hair, and that sincere smile that makes a person more beautiful than any outfit. "My God, she is beautiful," flashed in his mind, and he even thought, if I were younger, I would hug and kiss her. But gravity and shyness restrained that moment, because how could it be? Grown-up, dignified people. The restaurant was almost empty. Calm music played in the corner. They were seated at a cozy table by the window. The waiter was very polite and delicate, as if he understood. These two were not just having dinner. Today they were celebrating a small holiday that was more important than others. Suddenly there glimmered a tear in the corners of Megan's eyes. A tiny one, like a drop of rain that slipped in uninvited. She quickly wiped it away with the corner of a snow-white napkin, hoping John wouldn't notice. "Sorry, John," she whispered a bit guiltily. Just, it suddenly came over me. Memories, you know." John barely shook his head, smiling softly. "Oh, Megan, I understand. We are not the type to have dinner here every weekend. But today we decided to come." He quietly placed his large warm hand over her small one, hesitantly but firmly, and gently squeezed. In that touch, Megan felt something more than mere sympathy. There was something that wrapped her soul in warmth. what she had been missing all those years. And when she met John's gaze, she saw in his eyes something real, something very tender, like a quiet invitation to be closer, to be together. It was the same song of unspent love that sometimes comes into life when the sun is already leaning towards the horizon. A quiet yet so poignant and genuine